Hello, boys and girls. At this point, we're ready to move on to Chapter 7, which is about interest groups. And to introduce you to interest groups, I thought I'd do a little research, and here's what I found about interest groups in the 2020 election. It is said, according to OpenSecrets.com, that the 2020 election cost about $14 billion between the two candidates, Trump and Biden, blowing away spending records. Let's take a look. Here's the projected cost between congressional spending and presidential spending. And in 2016, it was about half that, congressional and presidential spending. This is incredible. You might ask yourself, how on earth does a campaign get so much money? The answer is interest groups. These huge companies and individual donors, but not just huge companies, get millions and billions of dollars to win elections. And this is why we must talk about this, is interest groups have a profound impact on policy and elections themselves. So let's start off and define an interest group. What is it? An interest group should be defined as an organized group of individuals that share common objectives or goals who attempt to influence policymaking. Okay? Take a moment and write any of these drop-ins down in these yellow boxes. The next thing that you need to know about is a lobbyist. We may have mentioned this before in our studies, but a lobbyist is an organization or a group who attempts to influence legislation, aka laws, and leadership decisions in government, usually by using money. Okay, take a moment and write that one down. So now that we got those two long definitions taken care of, most of the other ones should be shorter. All right. Here's what I want you to be aware of before we move on. When we study interest groups, you got to know that this is a longer chapter than we normally study, so it's going to take a little bit of grit to get through. The second thing is that there are going to be two times, that's right, two times where you're going to stop this video and do a task. So please make sure you do that, and then cue up the video again once you're done with the task. All right, on to the key idea about interest groups. Our government has easy access, aka multiple cracks, which allow interest groups to penetrate, in other words, get involved in our political system. The funny thing is, maybe you don't like interest groups, or maybe you do, is that it is constitutional, meaning it is allowed. So the reasons why we had nearly $14 billion in congressional and presidential election money spent in 2020 is because of all this easy access to politicians in our political system for people in interest groups to influence lawmaking. All right, at this point, you're going to do task number 1. Set a clock internally, maybe on your phone, maybe looking at a clock in class, and on an 8-minute timer, I want you to click on this document right here, this actual website. I want you to read and find out ways interest groups get involved in politics. Just be pretty vague, but try to get some specific ways that they get involved in politics, and write a short summary of your investigation results right here. And I started you off with this. Interest groups get involved in politics by, finish the sentence. Okay? Take a break right now, pause this video, and cue it up when you're done with your 8-minute study. All right, now that you're back, we're going to move on and talk about how interest groups are a natural thing, especially in the United States. This man in 1834, Alexis de Tocqueville, I don't know how to say that, but he's a French man, noted that in no country in the world has the principle of association, that means being part of a group, been more successfully used or applied to a greater multitude of objectives than in America. This traveler, Alexis Tocqueville, was super impressed about how interest groups, he didn't specifically name them, but how interest groups got involved in American politics. And he could see that being a foreigner. So what does this mean? This means that Americans form groups to solve civic problems, to make things better in their communities. I would highlight this. They do this to also form relationships or connections, and they speak for and against economic and political interests. So he's saying a lot about Americans and how they're really different than a lot of other groups in foreign countries. Now, James Madison also made a comment on interest groups, and he said that anti-federalists, which he was, remember, after becoming at first a federalist, anti-federalists believed in multiple organizations and in a multitude of interests because it would protect the ideas of the minority against oppression. This was a major anti-federalist idea in that we had to keep the interests of all the people, the common people, alive and at the forefront of our democracy if it were to succeed. Okay? All right. Point number 2 is this: 2/3 of all Americans belong to at least one association or interest group. So I thought to myself, Mr. Resch, what group are you a part of? And for many, many years as a teacher, I've been always a part of a teachers union. Okay? That is one real big way I'm a part of an association that works towards the greater good for teachers. If I was a hunter, and I am, I might be a member of the National Rifle Association, NRA, but I am not. But that is another interest group. Another important thing is some scholars believe that the continued growth of interest groups creates something called hyperpluralism. And I want you to focus in on hyperpluralism. Hyper meaning a lot, pluralism meaning many. And that is how interest groups mandate policy or defeat policies needed by the country and work against the public good. So we've got this great idea of lots of different groups of people trying to come together to make different policies that work for and against the public good. Okay? And here is James Madison. So try to remember Alexis de Tocqueville and James Madison here. On to the next section. What creates interest groups? Interest groups are created by social movements. Okay? Social movements create interest groups. And they're movements that usually start off by a large population that demands change in politics, economics, cultural ideas. And here are some examples. One such big movement in the early 1900s, late 1800s, was women's rights after the Civil War, okay, and how women fought to earn the right to vote. In the 50s and 60s, it was the civil rights movement, these large, extremely large movements trying to grow support for added rights. Cesar Chavez, a guy I clearly spelled wrong here, in the mid 20th century also organized a pretty good farm movement and led a successful boycott, which we see in the picture here, of table grapes, you know, the green, the purple grapes that we eat in California that lasted 6 years. And these large movements tend to develop into interest groups that serve the greater good. Moving on. Think another might be a little bit uncomfortable for some of us, but it is a reality. That gay, lesbian, and transgender interest groups have worked really hard in the past 50 years, especially at the local and state levels. And they've even had some national level success in making changes for their rights. And they are a big interest group today as the LGBTQ plus group that really is being heard quite well, and they're getting changes. So what we need in this area is to get some examples of how they've changed things. And they were successful in repealing the don't ask, don't tell rule, which did at one point in our history say that military members could not come out of the closet, so to speak, as gay, lesbian, transgender, whatever it might have been in the military. It wasn't allowed, but nowadays they are allowed to be open about their preference. Okay, so that's an important thing, a little more freedom for them. They also repealed the Defense Against Marriage Act, and here's what that did. The federal government at a time in pretty recent history, in Bill Clinton's administration in the mid-90s, said that the federal government didn't have to recognize same-sex marriage, but they repealed that, and now the federal government does recognize same-sex marriage. And that group was also successful in campaigning for greater human rights. Lastly, on this little section is that social movements are often precursors, that means things that happened before, of the prior actions of interest groups. So, what are we talking about here? An example would be, I'm dropping this down, Occupy Wall Street. This was a social movement against economic inequality that started in 2011 in New York. Okay? So all this is, again, what creates interest groups, and we're finding that it is large populations of people that are demanding change that create these great big social movements, and out of those movements typically becomes an interest group. All right, so why are there so many interest groups? There are so many interest groups today because it is a right to join a group. It is protected by the First Amendment. And there's two parts of the First Amendment that is protected in allowing interest groups to thrive. The first is a peaceful right to assemble or to gather in groups. And the second is your right to petition, which is to request a change, to request something to be done differently. All right? Point number 2 here is that group membership makes individual opinions more powerful. Okay, so when you're in a group, obviously your voice is louder, you have more say, you have more sway, and all that. Third, there are also lots of pressure points, and I want you to be able to remember 4 pressure points. And these pressure points are where groups and individuals can have extreme influence in politics. So example number 1 is neighborhood groups. Think about neighborhood watch groups. They can have big impacts at the local level, city and states. Second is national and state groups can influence Congress greatly as well. Third, government corporations, big businesses can influence presidents at social events and fundraisers, paying for things for the president, just supporting the president in campaign funding and all that. They can help them win elections. Fourth, interest groups, which we've talked about. Remember, we define interest groups as organizational groups of individuals that share common objectives who attempt to influence policies. And interest groups, remember, can use the courts even to pursue political objectives. Final point here is that the openness of American politics is a major factor in the size and power that these groups have in American government. Your last thing today is to do a second task for me. You're going to study Occupy Wall Street, and what you're going to do is explore the impact of interest groups. You're going to use the internet and summarize the idea of Occupy Wall Street on politics in America by answering these 4 questions. 1, define Occupy Wall Street in good detail. It should be about a sentence. Where and when did Occupy Wall Street begin? Earlier in the notes, I gave you a hint there. 3, which political party gained the most traction or momentum as a result of Occupy Wall Street? And then 4, this is going to take a bit of thought and a bit of digging, so don't expect this to be done super fast, is write at least 2 examples that show how Occupy Wall Street changed policy or laws in America. All right, I'm going to leave you with that, boys and girls. Feel free to email me or message me with any questions. Thank you.